While working as a flight attendant on a flight to Los Angeles, the woman froze as she realized the Millionaire passenger was her husband who died 5 years ago. She approached and Vivian adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath, preparing herself for another long flight from New York to Los Angeles. As a flight attendant, she had grown used to the routine of greeting passengers, offering drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. It was a job she enjoyed, even if it meant spending long hours away from her home in Chicago and her 7-year-old daughter, Emily. This time, however, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been lingering all day. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of a busy week, or the unsettling memories that always seemed to creep in when she was thousands of feet in the air. The flight had been relatively smooth so far. Vivian moved gracefully up and down the aisle, exchanging polite smiles and brief conversations with the passengers. She was delivering a tray of drinks to the first-class section when she heard a burst of laughter. It was a rich, carefree laugh, and she couldn't help but glance in the direction of the sound. That's when she saw him. Her heart stopped. The glass in her hand wobbled, nearly slipping from her grip. Seated comfortably in one of the plush seats was a man who looked exactly like Leonard, her husband who had died 5 years ago. He was laughing, his head tilted back slightly, a smile that was all too familiar. Sitting next to him was a young woman, beautiful and elegant, leaning in close, her eyes sparkling as she listened to whatever he was saying. Vivian felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She blinked, hoping that the image would change, that the man would be someone else entirely. But when she opened her eyes, there he was, still smiling, his hand resting casually on the armrest. Her mind raced. How could it be Leonard? She had been at his funeral. She had spent months mourning him, learning to live without him. But here he was, alive and apparently very much enjoying himself. For a moment, Vivian thought about approaching him, demanding an explanation, but her feet felt glued to the spot, her mind swirling in confusion and disbelief. What would she even say? What if it wasn't him, just someone who looked eerily similar? She had to be mistaken. Yet, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't ignore the sense of recognition deep within her. She forced herself to look away, setting the tray down on a nearby counter. She needed to regain her composure. This was impossible. Leonard had died in a car accident, and though his body had never been found, the authorities were certain he had been thrown into the river. The thought of it had haunted her for years, but she had eventually come to terms with it. She had no choice but to move on for Emily's sake. But now, what was she supposed to think? Vivian's hands were trembling, and she quickly clenched them, willing herself to focus. She needed to finish her shift, keep her professionalism intact. Whatever this was, she would have to deal with it later. Taking a deep breath, she straightened up, plastering a neutral expression on her face and continuing down the aisle. Yet, the image of Leonard's face, the sound of his laugh, echoed in her mind. When she passed by his seat again, she couldn't resist another quick glance. This time, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Her heart skipped a beat, a flicker of hope mingling with fear, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of surprise or acknowledgement. Instead, his gaze was cold, distant, as if she were just another flight attendant, a stranger serving drinks. Vivian felt her heart shatter all over again. She hurried to the back of the plane, finding an empty spot near the galley where she could be alone. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away, not wanting anyone to see her like this. What if it was really him? How could he pretend not to know her? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the fear of looking insane, of causing a scene on the plane, kept her silent. A colleague approached, noticing her distress. "Vivian, are you okay?" she asked softly, concern evident in her eyes. Vivian forced a smile, though it was weak and unconvincing. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little tired." The rest of the flight felt like an eternity. Every time she passed through the first-class section, She avoided looking in his direction, afraid of what she might see. Her mind kept replaying the moment, questioning her sanity. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, torn between wanting to confront him and running away from whatever this was. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Vivian's anxiety grew. What was she supposed to do when they landed? She couldn't just let him walk away without confronting him, but the thought of facing him filled her with dread. What if he denied everything? What if he laughed in her face? What if it wasn't him at all? Her thoughts were a tangled mess, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. When the plane touched down and the passengers started disembarking, Vivian's heart pounded in her chest. She watched as Leonard, or the man who looked like him, gathered his things and stood up. He walked past her without a second glance, his arm around the woman's waist, guiding her out of the plane. It was as if she didn't exist. Vivian stood frozen, tears brimming in her eyes, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. If this was Leonard, then everything she had believed for the past 5 years was a lie. And if it wasn't, then why did it feel like she had just lost him all over again? She took a deep, shaky breath, willing herself to hold it together as she prepared to face whatever awaited her on the ground. Vivian stepped off the plane, her mind still reeling from what she had seen. The airport terminal was bustling, but the noise around her felt distant, like she was moving through a fog. She clutched her bag tightly, her knuckles turning white, trying to focus on anything but the chaos in her head. The image of Leonard's face, his laughter, and the way he had looked right through her without a hint of recognition haunted her. She felt like she was caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As she made her way to the crew area to change out of her uniform, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the babysitter, sending a picture of Emily curled up on the couch, asleep with a book clutched to her chest. A small smile tugged at the corner of Vivian's mouth, but it faded quickly as reality set back in. Emily was the one thing that had kept her going all these years. She had been just 2 years old when Leonard died, far too young to understand why her father wasn't coming home. Vivian had dedicated herself to being both a mother and a father, pouring everything she had into making sure Emily felt loved and safe. But now, all of that seemed to be crumbling around her. If Leonard was alive, why had he let them think he was dead? How could he have abandoned her and their daughter? The questions buzzed in her head, growing louder with each passing minute. She tried to push them down, telling herself that she needed to focus on the present. Maybe it had been a mistake, a cruel trick of the mind. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. Vivian quickly changed out of her uniform and checked her schedule for the next flight. She had a few hours before she needed to head back to Chicago, but she wasn't sure she could wait that long to figure out what was going on. She needed to get some air, clear her head. She decided to step outside the terminal, hoping the cool night air would help her calm down. As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her pulse quickening. The message was short, but it sent chills down her spine. "I saw you looking at me on the plane. We need to talk." Vivian's heart skipped a beat. Was this Leonard? She wanted to reply, but her hands trembled as she typed. What could she possibly say? She deleted the message she had started to write and stuffed her phone back into her bag. She didn't know what she was feeling. Fear, anger, confusion. It was all too much. Just as she was about to step outside, she heard a familiar voice call her name. Vivian. She turned to see Grant walking toward her, a friendly smile on his face. He was still dressed in his business attire, looking like he had just stepped out of an important meeting. "I wasn't sure I'd catch you before you left." Vivian forced a smile, trying to act like everything was normal. "Grant, hey, what are you still doing here?" "I had a meeting run late, and then I figured I'd grab a late flight back to San Francisco," he said, casually glancing around. "But I saw you, and I thought maybe I could give you a ride to your hotel or wherever you're headed. You seemed a bit distracted earlier." For a moment, Vivian hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted company right now, but the idea of sitting alone with her thoughts felt unbearable. Maybe talking to Grant would help her get out of her head, even if just for a little while. "A ride sounds nice, actually," she said, her voice barely masking the relief she felt. As they walked out to the parking lot, Grant talked about his hectic schedule, his meetings, and a recent business deal that had gone south. His casual, easygoing manner was a welcome distraction from the storm inside her mind. Vivian found herself nodding along, even managing to laugh at a joke he made about the perils of networking events. It felt good, almost normal, and for a moment she could pretend that everything was okay. Once they were in his car, Grant glanced over at her. "You sure you're all right, Vivian? You seemed a little off on the flight earlier," she bit her lip, debating whether to tell him the truth. Could she really trust him with something so bizarre, so personal? But when she looked at his kind, sincere eyes, she felt a small sense of comfort. "I saw someone on the plane," she started, her voice hesitant. "Someone who looked exactly like my husband. The thing is, my husband passed away 5 years ago." Grant's expression softened. "That must have been really hard for you, losing someone like that." "It was," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't just a resemblance. It was him. I'm sure of it." Grant's brow furrowed as he listened, his face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Did you talk to him?" "No," she admitted, feeling a pang of regret. "He was with someone and he looked right at me but acted like he didn't know me. It was like I was invisible." Grant was silent for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. "I'm no expert, but maybe it's worth finding out more before jumping to any conclusions. If it was really him, there has to be an explanation, right?" Vivian wanted to believe that, but the fear of what she might uncover was paralyzing. "I don't know if I'm ready to deal with whatever this is," she said softly, looking out the window as the city lights blurred past. "I just want things to go back to the way they were." "I get that," Grant said gently. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that running away from the truth never makes it easier. If you need someone to help you figure this out, I'm here." Vivian turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Why are you being so nice to me?" "Because I know what it's like to lose someone," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "And I know how it feels when you're left with nothing but questions." Vivian felt her eyes sting with unshed tears. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to understand, to just listen. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As they continued driving, she found herself sharing more about Leonard, about how they had met, how he had been a loving husband and father, and how everything had shattered the day he died. Grant listened without interrupting, and by the time they reached her hotel, she felt like a weight had been lifted, even if just a little. "Get some rest," Grant said as she got out of the car. "And if you need anything, even if it's just someone to talk to, give me a call." Vivian nodded, her heart feeling a little lighter. "I will. Thanks, Grant." She watched as he drove away, his taillights disappearing into the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this. The next day, Vivian woke up feeling groggy, as if she hadn't slept at all. Her dreams had been a mix of confusing images, Leonard's face appearing and disappearing, leaving her with more questions than answers. She lay in bed for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. Eventually, she reached for her phone and scrolled through her messages, her eyes landing on one from Grant. "Good morning, Vivian. I hope you're feeling a little better today. If you're free, how about dinner tonight?" My treat. Vivian hesitated for a moment. Part of her wanted to retreat, to shut herself off and avoid dealing with anyone. But another part of her, the part that was tired of feeling alone, wanted to see Grant again. She needed to escape the whirlwind of thoughts in her head, even if just for a few hours. Taking a deep breath, she typed back, "Dinner sounds nice. What time?" The response came almost immediately. "Let's say 7. I'll pick you up." Vivian couldn't help but smile at his eagerness. "See you then," she replied. And with that, she forced herself to get out of bed and face the day. The hours seemed to drag, but finally, it was time for her to get ready. She decided on a simple, elegant dress, one that made her feel comfortable, yet confident. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She had been so focused on being a mother, on working, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be herself, to feel a little bit glamorous. Maybe tonight would help her remember. When Grant arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile that made her feel instantly at ease. "You look great," he said, his eyes shining with sincerity. "Ready to go?" They drove to a cozy little restaurant, tucked away from the busy streets. It wasn't a flashy, high-end place, but rather somewhere quiet and inviting, with dim lighting and a warm atmosphere. Vivian appreciated the choice. It felt intimate, like they could talk without the world watching. Over dinner, their conversation flowed easily. Grant told her more about his life, his work, and his love for traveling. He talked about his recent business ventures, the challenges he faced, and how he sometimes felt like he was always chasing the next big deal. Vivian listened, intrigued by how different their worlds were. He was always in control, always moving forward, while she often felt like she was stuck in the past, unable to let go of what she had lost. "I admire you," Grant said suddenly, his tone sincere. "You've been through so much, and yet, here you are, holding everything together. It takes a lot of strength to do that." Vivian felt a blush creeping up her cheeks. "I don't know if I'd call it strength," she said, her voice soft. "Some days it feels like I'm just trying to survive." "But you are surviving," he said, leaning in slightly. "And that's something. I've met a lot of people who wouldn't be able to do half of what you do." There was a moment of silence as Vivian absorbed his words. She hadn't expected to feel so seen, so understood. "Thank you, Grant," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I really needed to hear that." As the evening went on, they found themselves laughing more, sharing stories about their childhoods and dreams they had once had. For the first time in a long while, Vivian felt like she could breathe, like she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. Grant was easy to talk to, and she appreciated how he listened, genuinely interested in what she had to say. After they finished their meal, Grant suggested they take a walk. The night was cool, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of the ocean. They strolled along the street, their conversation becoming more lighthearted, drifting away from the heavy topics of loss and grief. Vivian felt herself relax, letting go of the tension that had been building inside her for days. As they walked, Grant turned to her with a curious expression. "Can I ask you something, Vivian?" "Of course," she replied, wondering what was on his mind. "What would you do if you had a second chance?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "At something you thought was gone forever?" Vivian's heart skipped a beat. The question hit closer to home than he could have known. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess it would depend on what it was." Grant nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Sometimes, I think we don't get second chances because we're too afraid to take them," he said. "But if one comes along, I hope you're brave enough to see where it leads." Vivian looked at him, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words. There was something about the way he spoke, as if he was hinting at something deeper, something personal. But before she could ask, he smiled and changed the subject, and she decided to let it go, at least for now. By the time they returned to the car, Vivian felt lighter, as if a small piece of the burden she carried had been lifted. Grant had a way of making her feel like everything was going to be okay, even when she wasn't sure how. As he drove her back to her hotel, she found herself wishing the night didn't have to end. "I had a really great time tonight," she said as they pulled up to the entrance. "Thank you, Grant." "Me too," he replied, his smile warm and genuine. "I'm glad you agreed to come out. I hope we can do it again sometime." Vivian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." She stepped out of the car, but before she closed the door, she looked back at him. "Good night, Grant." "Good night, Vivian," he said, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Take care of yourself." As she watched him drive away, she felt a strange mix of emotions. It had been a long time since she had let herself get close to anyone, let alone enjoy their company. But Grant was different. He made her feel safe, even when everything else in her life felt like it was spinning out of control. She walked into the hotel, her mind still buzzing from the evening. But as she reached her room, the earlier events of the flight crept back into her thoughts, casting a shadow over the warmth she had felt. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. If that man was Leonard, she needed answers. But the thought of confronting him, of opening old wounds, terrified her. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized she was at a crossroads. She could keep pretending that nothing had happened, that her life could go back to normal. Or she could find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And as much as she wanted to avoid it, she knew deep down that she couldn't move on without knowing why Leonard had let her believe he was dead. Vivian closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Tomorrow, she would start looking for answers, and whatever she found, she would face it, even if it meant tearing her world apart all over again. Vivian returned to Chicago with a sense of purpose that had been missing for a long time. She had spent most of the flight back thinking about her evening with Grant, replaying their conversation in her head. It had been a long time since she felt that comfortable around someone, and there was something about him that made her want to open up, even when her instincts told her to keep her guard up. But now that she was back home, the reality of what she had seen on that flight started creeping back into her mind, and she knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The morning after her return, she went through her usual routine of making breakfast for Emily, helping her get ready for school, and then heading out to catch up on some errands. But as she walked through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, her thoughts kept drifting back to Leonard. She had tried to convince herself that it was all a mistake, that it was just someone who looked like him. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen her husband, alive and well, on that plane. After dropping Emily off at school, Vivian sat in her car, staring blankly out the window. The buzzing of her phone broke her trance. She looked down to see a new message from Grant. "How are you holding up? I've been thinking about you." Vivian felt a pang of warmth as she read the message. For a moment, she thought about telling him everything, about Leonard, the strange encounter, the confusion that had been eating away at her. But she hesitated. She barely understood what was happening herself, and the idea of opening up to someone who, despite his kindness, was still a new presence in her life, felt daunting. Instead, she replied, "I'm okay, just trying to keep busy. How about you?" The response came quickly. "Busy as always, but not too busy to take you out again. How about dinner tonight?" Vivian hesitated. She had been hoping to use the evening to clear her mind, maybe even try to find out more about Leonard. But at the same time, the idea of seeing Grant again, of escaping her thoughts for a few hours, was tempting. After a moment of internal debate, she decided to say yes. "Dinner sounds great. Same time?" "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 7. The day seemed to pass in a blur, and before she knew it, she was standing in front of her mirror, getting ready for her evening with Grant. She chose a dark blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and pulled her hair back into a neat ponytail. As she added the finishing touches, she found herself thinking back to the last time she had gotten this dressed up for a date. It felt strange, but also nice, like she was rediscovering a part of herself that she had almost forgotten. Grant arrived right on time, as usual. He greeted her with a smile that was equal parts charming and genuine, and Vivian felt her nerves ease a little. As they drove to the restaurant, their conversation flowed easily, picking up right where they had left off the last time. Grant was good at making her laugh, at distracting her from the mess that had been swirling in her head for the past few days. Over dinner, Vivian found herself opening up more than she had intended. She told Grant about her life with Emily, how she balanced work and motherhood, and even a little about the grief she had carried since losing Leonard. She didn't go into too much detail, but just talking about it felt like a release. Grant listened attentively, nodding and offering words of comfort, never pushing her to say more than she was ready to. "I don't know how you do it," he said after she finished talking. "Raising a child on your own, working a job that keeps you away so often, it sounds exhausting." Vivian shrugged, smiling softly. "It is, sometimes, but I do it for Emily. She's my world, and I'd do anything to make sure she's happy." Grant's expression softened. "You're a good mother, Vivian. Anyone can see that." Vivian felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I try." They continued talking, the conversation drifting from one topic to another, until the restaurant began to empty out and they realized they had been there for hours. It was only when the waiter brought the check that they reluctantly acknowledged the night was coming to an end. As they stepped outside, Grant turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian nodded, curious. "Of course." "I've noticed you seem preoccupied. Even when you're laughing, there's this sadness behind your eyes. I don't want to pry, but if there's something bothering you, I'm here to listen." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized it was that obvious, that her attempts to act normal had been so transparent. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to tell him she was fine and leave it at that. But as she looked at him, standing there with that sincere, gentle expression, she found herself wanting to tell him the truth. "There is something," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's complicated, and I don't even know where to start." Grant stepped closer, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Then start wherever you feel comfortable. I'm not going anywhere." Vivian hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't want to scare him off, didn't want to burden him with the mess that her life had suddenly become. But she also didn't want to keep lying, not to someone who had been so kind to her. "I think I saw my husband," she said finally, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "On my last flight. The problem is, my husband died 5 years ago." Grant's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't say anything, letting her continue. "It was just a moment, and maybe I was wrong, but I can't shake this feeling that it was him, that he's alive." For a moment, Grant was silent, processing her words. "Vivian, I can't imagine how confusing this must be for you. But if there's even a chance that it was him, don't you want to find out for sure?" "I don't know," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Part of me is terrified of what I might find. What if he really is alive and he chose to stay away? What does that say about everything we had?" Grant took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "I can't pretend to understand what you're going through, but I do know one thing. Whatever the truth is, you deserve to know it. And if you need someone to help you find those answers, I'm here." Vivian looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why are you being so nice to me, Grant?" "Because I care," he said simply. "And because I've seen how strong you are. I know you can face whatever comes, even if it's not what you hoped for." Vivian felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of gratitude and something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." They stood there for a moment, the night air cool around them, and for the first time, Vivian allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing this alone. As they got back into the car, she found herself thinking that Grant had a way of making everything seem a little less scary, a little more manageable, and she was grateful for that. By the time they reached her house, she felt lighter than she had in days. "I had a really nice time tonight," she said, her smile genuine. "Me too," Grant replied. "And remember, whatever you decide, I'm here." Vivian nodded, watching him drive away. She still didn't know what she was going to do, but for the first time, she felt like she had a choice. She could keep pretending, or she could start searching for answers. And with Grant by her side, maybe she'd finally find the courage to do just that. Vivian spent the next few days feeling like she was walking on a tightrope, balanced precariously between the life she knew and the terrifying unknown. Every time she thought about what she had seen on that flight, her mind spiraled into a tangle of questions that she had no answers for. She tried to focus on her routine, taking care of Emily, preparing for her next set of flights. But the sense of unease was always there, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. It was late on a Friday evening, and Vivian had just put Emily to bed. She was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly washing the dishes, when she heard a knock at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. It was rare for her to get visitors at this hour, and her mind immediately went to Grant. Maybe he had come to check on her, to offer more of his comforting words and easy smiles. But when she opened the door, the sight that greeted her was not what she had expected. Standing there, looking tired and disheveled, was Leonard. Vivian's blood ran cold. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But as she blinked and tried to steady her breathing, she realized this was no illusion. Leonard was there, alive and real, staring back at her with eyes that were both familiar and foreign. "Vivian," he said, his voice low and strained, like he hadn't used it in days. "We need to talk." She felt like the world was spinning around her. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say, to scream at him, but all she managed was a shaky, How is this possible?" "Can I come in?" he asked, glancing around nervously, as if expecting someone to be watching. "I promise I'll explain everything, but not here." Every instinct told her to slam the door in his face, to tell him to go away and never come back, but she couldn't move. Her legs frozen in place, her mind still trying to process the fact that her supposedly dead husband was standing right in front of her. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside and let him in. They sat down at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. Vivian's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, trying to appear calm even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Start talking," she said, her voice barely masking the mix of anger and confusion boiling inside her. Leonard took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, his eyes hollow and weary. "I know you have every reason to hate me right now, and I don't blame you," he began. "But I need you to hear me out." Vivian said nothing, her gaze fixed on him, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of the last 5 years of her life. "I faked my death," he said finally, the words hanging in the air like a bombshell. "It was the only way to get out of a situation that had gotten out of control." Vivian felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "You faked your death," she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "Why? Why would you do that? Do you have any idea what you put me and Emily through?" Leonard's expression softened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I know, Vivian. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I was in trouble. Real trouble. I was working for a company that was involved in some shady business. Investments, money laundering, things that I didn't fully understand until it was too late. When I found out, I tried to back out, but they wouldn't let me. They threatened me, threatened you and Emily." Vivian's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "So you thought the best way to protect us was to make us think you were dead," she said, her voice rising. "How does that make any sense, Leonard?" "I was desperate," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what else to do. If I disappeared, they'd stop looking for me and you and Emily would be safe. I thought it was the only way." Vivian felt like she was going to be sick. "And all this time, you just stayed away. You let us think you were gone. You let Emily grow up without a father." She couldn't hold back the tears anymore, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. "Do you have any idea how cruel that was?" Leonard reached across the table, as if trying to touch her hand, but she pulled away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes brimming with guilt. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but things didn't go as planned. I couldn't stay hidden forever. They found me, and now I'm running again. That's why I came to you. I need your help." Vivian stared at him, her mind reeling. "My help," she said, incredulous. "What could you possibly want from me after all this?" Leonard took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for her reaction. "I have money, enough to make sure you and Emily are taken care of for the rest of your lives. But I need a place to stay, just for a little while, until I can figure out my next move. If you help me, I swear you'll never have to worry about anything again." Vivian's eyes widened, and she could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You want me to hide you, after everything you've done?" "It's not just for me," he insisted, his voice desperate. "It's for Emily. Think about what that money could do for her. She could go to the best schools, have a future without any of the struggles you've had to deal with." Vivian felt a wave of anger surge through her, and she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't you dare use her to justify this," she said, her voice shaking. "You abandoned us, Leonard. You made your choice when you left us to grieve for you. And now you show up, expecting me to just go along with whatever scheme you've cooked up. I don't even know who you are anymore." Leonard stood as well, his eyes pleading. "I'm still the man you married, Vivian. I'm still Emily's father. Please, I'm begging you. I just need a little time." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the tension thick between them. Vivian's mind was spinning, torn between the love she once had for him and the anger she felt now. She wanted to scream, to tell him to get out and never come back. But she could see the fear in his eyes, and for a brief moment, she glimpsed the man she had once loved, the man she had thought she'd lost forever. She closed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything. "I don't know what you want from me, Leonard," she said quietly, "but I can't help you. Not after everything." Leonard's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of her words had crushed him. "Please, Vivian, I don't have anywhere else to go." "Then maybe you should have thought of that before you disappeared," she said, her voice cold. "Now get out. I don't want you near me, and I don't want you anywhere near Emily." Leonard hesitated, looking like he wanted to say more, but he must have seen the resolve in her eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Vivian followed him, her heart aching with every step. But she forced herself to stay strong. As he reached for the doorknob, he glanced back at her one last time. "If you change your mind," he said softly, "you know how to find me." Vivian didn't reply. She watched him leave, closing the door behind him, and as the lock clicked into place, she felt the first sob escape her lips. She had spent years mourning his death, only to find out that he had chosen to disappear, leaving her and Emily to pick up the pieces. And now he was back, bringing chaos into her life once again. As she sank to the floor, her head in her hands, she realized that whatever this was, it was far from over, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to face it. The days that followed Leonard's sudden reappearance felt like a blur. Vivian moved through her routine on autopilot, taking care of Emily, going to work, and trying to keep her emotions in check. But inside, she felt like she was barely holding it together. The shock of seeing Leonard alive after 5 years of believing he was dead had thrown her entire world off balance, and she didn't know how to make sense of it. She kept replaying their conversation over and over, questioning everything he had said, and yet she still didn't have any answers. Vivian tried to distract herself by focusing on Emily, who, as always, was blissfully unaware of the turmoil going on around her. Emily's laughter, her stories about school, and her endless curiosity were a welcome distraction, but they couldn't drown out the persistent questions that haunted Vivian's thoughts. Why had Leonard faked his death? What kind of trouble had he gotten himself into? And most importantly, why had he come back now? It was late in the evening, a few days after Leonard's visit, when Vivian's phone buzzed with a new message. She picked it up, half expecting it to be from Grant, who had been checking in on her more frequently lately. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Leonard. "We need to talk. Please, just hear me out. I'm at the park near your house. I'll wait for you." Vivian stared at the message, her stomach twisting. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend like he had never reached out. But she knew that wouldn't make the situation go away. She needed answers, and as much as she hated to admit it, she wasn't going to get them by avoiding him. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and quietly slipped out the door, making sure not to wake Emily. The park was quiet when she arrived, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. She spotted Leonard sitting on a bench, his hands clasped together, his posture tense. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. "Thank you for coming," Leonard said, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't come here for you," Vivian replied, crossing her arms. "I came because I need to know the truth. Why are you really here, Leonard? What do you want from me?" Leonard sighed, looking down at his hands. "I'm in trouble, Vivian. Worse than before. They found me, the people I was running from. And now I don't know what to do. I need your help." Vivian clenched her jaw, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I already told you I'm not going to help you hide. You can't just show up out of nowhere and expect me to solve your problems." "I'm not asking you to solve anything," he said, his eyes pleading. "I just need a place to stay, just for a little while, until I can figure out my next move. And I'll make it worth your while." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Leonard reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. "Open it." She hesitated for a moment before taking the envelope and opening it. Inside was a check, with an amount that made her breath catch in her throat. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, enough to cover Emily's education, their living expenses, and more. But the sight of it didn't bring her any comfort. Instead, it filled her with a sense of dread. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's money I managed to set aside before everything went wrong," Leonard explained. "I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but it could change everything for you and Emily. You wouldn't have to work so hard worrying about making ends meet. You could give her the life she deserves." Vivian felt her hands tremble as she held the check. "So this is what it comes down to," she said bitterly. "You think you can buy your way back into our lives?" "No, that's not it," Leonard said, his tone desperate. "I'm not trying to buy anything. I'm trying to make things right, even if it's just a little. I don't have much to offer anymore, but I can at least make sure you and Emily are taken care of." Vivian's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her wanted to tear up the check and throw it back at him, to scream at him for thinking he could make up for everything with money. But another part of her, the part that had spent years worrying about Emily's future, couldn't help but consider what that money could do. She had worked herself to the bone, taking every shift she could just to make sure Emily had what she needed. The idea of not having to struggle anymore, of being able to give Emily the best, was tempting, even if it came from someone she could barely stand to look at. "I don't understand, Leonard," she said finally, her voice wavering. "Why now? Why did you come back now, after all this time?" "Because I'm running out of options," he admitted. "The people I was involved with, they're dangerous. I thought I could stay hidden, but they found me. And if they find me, they'll come after anyone close to me, including you and Emily. I know I've messed everything up, but I'm trying to keep you safe." Vivian shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to pretend like you're protecting us. You left us, Leonard. You made that choice. And now you want to drag us back into your mess?" "I'm not trying to drag you into anything," he said, his voice cracking. "I just want to make sure you're okay. I want to give Emily the future she deserves." "And what about her father?" Vivian shot back. "What kind of future does she have knowing you abandoned her?" Leonard flinched, as if her words had physically hurt him. "I know I can't fix what I did," he said softly, "but I can try to make it right in whatever way I can. Please, Vivian, just let me stay for a little while. I'll be gone before you know it, and you'll never have to see me again." Vivian stared at him, her mind a tangle of anger, confusion, and a flicker of hope. She had spent so long believing Leonard was dead, mourning him, trying to move on. Now he was here, alive and desperate, offering her a way out of the struggles she had faced alone. But the cost of accepting his help felt too high, and she didn't know if she could trust anything he said. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just make this decision right now." Leonard nodded, relief washing over his features. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." Vivian turned away, unable to look at him any longer. "I need to go home," she said, her tone hollow. "Emily's waiting." As she walked away, Leonard called after her, his voice softer than before. "I'm sorry, Vivian, for everything." She didn't respond. She just kept walking, her heart heavy with the weight of everything he had told her. She wanted to hate him, to make him pay for everything he had put her through. But as much as she tried, she couldn't ignore the part of her that still remembered the man she had loved, the man she had married. When she got back to her house, she sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the check Leonard had given her. She thought about Emily, about the future she wanted to give her, and about the man who had once been her whole world. No matter how much she tried to push it away, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, and whatever decision she made would change everything. Vivian woke up the next morning feeling like she hadn't slept at all. The events of the night before replayed in her mind, making her feel like she was caught in a loop she couldn't escape. Seeing Leonard again, hearing him plead for her help, had brought back so many emotions she thought she had buried. She wanted to move on, but now she felt more trapped than ever, torn between her past and her present. After dropping Emily off at school, she found herself driving aimlessly around the city, her thoughts too tangled to focus on anything. She didn't want to go back home and risk running into Leonard again, and she certainly didn't want to be alone with her thoughts. As she passed by a familiar cafe, she remembered Grant's message from the previous day, offering to talk. Without really thinking about it, she pulled into the parking lot and took out her phone. "Are you free for a coffee this morning?" she typed, hesitating for a moment before hitting send. The response was almost immediate. "I can be there in 15 minutes. Vivian let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She walked into the cafe and found a table by the window, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure what she was going to say to Grant, but she knew she needed to talk to someone. And for some reason, she felt like he was the only person who could help her make sense of everything. True to his word, Grant arrived 15 minutes later, looking as polished and put together as always. He spotted her immediately, his expression softening when he saw the exhaustion on her face. "Hey," he said as he sat down across from her. "You look like you've had a rough night." Vivian managed a weak smile. "You could say that." Grant ordered them both coffee, and for a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the barista work behind the counter. Vivian felt strangely at ease, like the chaos of her life was momentarily suspended just by being in his presence. When their coffees arrived, she took a sip, savoring the warmth, before finally speaking. "I saw him again," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on her cup. "Leonard, he came to my house last night." Grant's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his attention fully on her. "What did he say?" "He wants me to help him," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in trouble, and he thinks hiding out with me is the only way to stay safe. He even offered me money, a lot of it, to let him stay." Grant's expression darkened, a flicker of something sharp and protective flashing in his eyes. "Vivian," you don't owe him anything. After what he did, after he disappeared and left you to pick up the pieces, he has no right to ask for your help." "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "But he made it sound like it was the only way to protect me and Emily. He said the people he was running from are dangerous, and if they find him, they might come after us, too." Grant's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he was silent, as if trying to process everything she had told him. "And do you believe him?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Vivian admitted, her hands shaking. "I want to believe that he's telling the truth, but I can't forget what he did. He let me think he was dead for 5 years. Grant. 5 years. How am I supposed to trust anything he says now?" Grant reached across the table and gently took her hand in his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to do this alone, Vivian. If you need someone to help you figure this out, I'm here." Vivian looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why are you being so nice to me, Grant? You barely know me." "Because I see how much you're struggling," he said softly. "And I can't stand the thought of you going through this by yourself. You deserve better than that." For a moment, they just sat there, their hands still entwined, the world outside the cafe fading away. Vivian felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. Grant was offering her something she hadn't had in years: support, understanding, and maybe even a chance to start over. After a while, Grant spoke again, his tone more serious. "Vivian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you want to help Leonard?" The question took her by surprise, and for a moment, she didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me still loves him, or at least the man he used to be. But I don't know if I can forgive him for what he did. And I'm scared, Grant. I'm scared of getting pulled back into something I can't handle." Grant squeezed her hand, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You don't have to make this decision right now, but whatever you decide, I'll support you. And if Leonard is a threat, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't hurt you or Emily." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on trying to figure everything out on her own that she hadn't even considered the possibility that someone might be willing to help her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." They spent the next hour talking, and for the first time in days, Vivian felt like she could breathe. Grant was easy to talk to, and he didn't push her to make any decisions she wasn't ready for. He simply listened, offering quiet support and gentle reassurances. By the time they finished their coffee, she felt lighter, as if a small piece of the burden she was carrying had been lifted. As they left the cafe, Grant turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I know this might sound forward, but would you and Emily like to join me for dinner tonight? I think it would be good for you to get out of the house, and I'd love to spend more time with you both." Vivian hesitated, but the idea of spending the evening with Grant instead of stewing in her own thoughts was tempting. "I think Emily would like that," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And so would I." Grant's smile widened, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to melt away. "Great. I'll pick you up at 6. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and for once, Vivian didn't spend every minute thinking about Leonard. Instead, she focused on getting ready for the evening, helping Emily pick out a dress, and trying to find something to wear that didn't make her look like she had been through a week of sleepless nights. When 6 o'clock rolled around, Grant arrived, and the three of them headed to a cozy family restaurant a few blocks away. Dinner was lighthearted and fun, and for the first time, Vivian saw a different side of Grant. He was playful and attentive with Emily, making her laugh with silly jokes and stories, and she found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. It was easy to forget, even if just for a few hours, about the chaos her life had become. As they finished their meal, Emily excused herself to go to the restroom, leaving Vivian and Grant alone at the table. "Thank you for this," Vivian said softly, her gaze meeting his. "I didn't realize how much I needed it." "I'm glad you came," Grant replied, his smile warm. "I meant what I said, Vivian. You don't have to face this alone." For a moment, they just sat there, the words unspoken between them. Vivian felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of comfort that she hadn't felt in a long time. But just as she was about to speak, her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced down, and her heart sank when she saw the sender's name, Leonard. "I need to see you. Tonight." Vivian's hands trembled as she read the message, the brief respite she had felt shattering in an instant. She knew she had to respond, but she didn't want to. Not now. Not when she was finally starting to feel okay. Grant noticed the change in her expression and frowned. "Vivian, is everything all right?" She looked up at him, struggling to keep her voice steady. "It's Leonard. He wants to meet tonight." Grant's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to say something. But he stopped himself. "Do you want to go?" Vivian didn't know how to answer. She wanted to say no, to ignore Leonard's message and stay with Grant, where she felt safe. But she also knew that avoiding the situation wouldn't make it go away. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I think I have to." Grant reached out and gently touched her arm. "Then let me come with you. Whatever happens, you don't have to do it alone." Vivian hesitated, but the thought of facing Leonard again without Grant's support was too much to bear. "Okay," she whispered, "but please, just be there. Don't get involved unless you have to." Grant nodded, his gaze steady and reassuring. "I'll be there, Vivian. I promise." Vivian's heart was pounding as she and Grant drove through the quiet streets, heading to the place where she had agreed to meet Leonard. The evening air was cool, and the city lights flickered past the car windows, casting shadows across her face. She felt a mix of dread and anticipation, knowing that whatever happened tonight could change everything. Grant was silent beside her, his expression calm but alert, as if preparing himself for whatever might come. They arrived at a small, secluded park on the outskirts of the city, a place Vivian hadn't been to in years. It was nearly deserted, with only a few distant figures walking their dogs or jogging along the paths. Leonard had chosen this spot for a reason. It was quiet, out of the way, a place where they wouldn't draw attention. As they parked and got out of the car, Vivian took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Grant asked, his voice low. "You don't have to go through with it if you're not ready." "I have to," she replied, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I need answers, and I need to hear them from him." Grant nodded, his gaze steady. "I'll be right here. If you need me, just say the word." They walked together to a bench under a street lamp, where Leonard was already waiting. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, more haggard, more worn, as if the days since their previous conversation had taken a toll on him. When he saw her approaching, he stood up, glancing nervously at Grant, but not saying anything. Vivian stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I'm here. What do you want, Leonard?" "I'm glad you came," Leonard said, his voice sounding strained. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening," she replied, her tone cold, "but I'm not promising anything." Leonard glanced at Grant, clearly uncomfortable with his presence. "Can we talk alone?" he asked, his eyes flicking back to Vivian. "Just for a few minutes." "No," she said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of him." Leonard's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, but then he seemed to give up. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself, and began to speak. "I was involved in a scheme with the company I worked for. A scheme that involved a lot of money, illegal transfers, and deals that never should have happened. I thought I could handle it, that I could make a clean break without anyone getting hurt. But I was wrong. When I tried to back out, They threatened me. They told me if I didn't cooperate, they would come after you and Emily. Vivian's hands clenched into fists. So your solution was to disappear, to make us think you were dead? I thought it was the only way to keep you safe, Leonard said, his voice breaking. I thought if they believed I was dead, they'd leave you alone. I know it sounds insane, but I didn't see any other option. And now? Vivian asked, her tone sharp. What changed? They found out I was still alive, he said, his eyes dark with fear. I've been on the run ever since, but they're closing in on me, and I don't have anywhere left to go. That's why I came back. I need a place to hide, at least until I can figure out a way to disappear for good. Vivian felt a wave of anger surge through her. You want me to help you hide after everything you've done? After you left me to grieve for you? To raise our daughter on my own? I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that, Leonard said, his voice desperate. But I'm trying to make things right. I have money, enough to take care of you and Emily, to give her a future. I just need a little time. Vivian's mind was reeling. Part of her still couldn't believe what she was hearing, that the man she had once loved could have been involved in something so dangerous, so deceitful. What makes you think I can trust anything you're saying? She demanded. How do I know you're not just using me to save your own skin? Leonard's eyes filled with tears. Because I don't have anyone else, Vivian. You're the only person I've ever truly loved, and I'm begging you to help me, not for my sake, but for Emily's. For a moment, there was silence, and then Grant stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Vivian, I need to tell you something, he said, his voice calm but firm. Something you deserve to know. Vivian turned to him, confused. What is it? So Grant took deep breaths, and for a moment she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. Guiding Leonard for the past 2 years, he said, his words slow and deliberate. I'm one of the victims of the scheme he was involved in. My company lost millions because of what he did, and I've been trying to track down responsible. That's how I ended up here. Vivian's heart stopped. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. You were investigating him. I didn't know about you, Vivian, Grant said, his tone gentle. Not until recently. When I realized who you were, I didn't know how to tell you. But I had to make sure you were safe, that Leonard wasn't going to drag you and Emily into something dangerous. Vivian felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She stared at Grant, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. So all this time, you've been using me. No, Grant said quickly, his voice filled with emotion. It started as an investigation, but it became so much more. I care about you, Vivian. Everything I've said, everything I've felt, it's real. But I couldn't stand by and watch him manipulate you again. Leonard's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his expression one of shock. You set me up, he said, his voice trembling. You're working with them. I'm working with the authorities, Grant corrected, his tone cold. And I'm going to make sure you face the consequences of what you've done. Vivian's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She felt betrayed, confused, and hurt. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? Because I was afraid, Grant admitted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, that you'd push me away, and I couldn't stand the thought of losing you. Vivian didn't know what to say. She looked from Grant to Leonard, two men who had both lied to her, who had both kept secrets that had shattered her world. I don't know who to believe, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't have to choose between us, Grant said softly. But you do need to choose what's best for you and Emily. Whatever happens, I'm on your side. Leonard stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Vivian, please, I'm begging you, don't let them take me. If you do this, I'll disappear forever, and you'll never have to see me again. Just let me go." Vivian felt a tear slip down her cheek. "You already disappeared, Leonard," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You left us a long time ago." Grant took out his phone and stepped away for a moment, speaking quietly into it. Vivian watched him, her mind numb, and then turned back to Leonard. "I loved you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help you. Not anymore." A moment later, 2 unmarked cars pulled up to the edge of the park, and several plainclothes officers stepped out. Grant approached them, speaking quietly, and they nodded before moving toward Leonard. "Leonard Dougherty," one of the officers said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Leonard didn't resist as they placed handcuffs on his wrists, but he looked back at Vivian, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and sorrow. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Vivian watched as they led him away, her heart breaking all over again. She had wanted answers, but now that she had them, she felt more lost than ever. As Leonard disappeared into the back of one of the cars, she felt Grant's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said softly. "But you did the right thing." Vivian turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what's right anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I just feel empty." Grant pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her as she cried. "You're not alone, Vivian," he whispered. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The ride back from the park was silent. Vivian sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind numb. She could barely process everything that had just happened, the image of Leonard being led away in handcuffs replaying in her mind over and over. She had wanted answers, but now she felt more lost than ever. She didn't know how to feel about Grant, about Leonard, or about the whirlwind of emotions that had been stirred up inside her. Grant drove quietly, glancing over at her occasionally, his expression unreadable. He seemed to understand that she needed space, but his presence was still comforting, a steady anchor in the chaos. When they finally pulled up in front of her house, he parked the car and turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Vivian, I'm sorry," he said softly. "I never wanted it to end this way, but you needed to know the truth. You deserve to know the truth." She didn't respond immediately, her mind still trying to process everything. She had been angry at Leonard, hurt by his lies, but now that he was gone, all she felt was emptiness. "You lied to me too," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You kept secrets from me." "I did," Grant admitted, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I'm sorry for that. I should have been honest with you from the beginning, but I was afraid. Afraid that you'd hate me, that you'd see me as just another person using you to get to Leonard. But everything I told you, everything I felt, that was real." Vivian looked at him, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Why didn't you tell me the truth sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were and what you were doing?" "Because I didn't want to lose you," Grant said, his voice filled with regret. "I've been hunting Leonard for years, trying to track down everyone who was involved in the scheme that ruined my company. But when I met you, everything changed. You weren't just a lead in an investigation. You were someone I cared about, and I didn't want to hurt you. But I knew that if I kept lying, it would hurt you even more." Vivian closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She wanted to believe him, to believe that everything between them hadn't been a lie, but she didn't know how. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "I thought I knew who Leonard was, and I was wrong. I thought I could trust you. But now, I just don't know." Grant reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I understand," he said softly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm here, Vivian. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Vivian wanted to pull her hand away, to tell him to leave, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She was tired of being alone, tired of carrying the weight of everything on her own. For now, she just wanted to feel like she had someone by her side, even if it was just for a little while. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I need time to figure out what all of this means." "Of course," Grant said, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." They sat in silence for a few more moments before Vivian finally pulled her hand away. "I should go inside," she said, her voice flat. "Emily will be waking up soon." "Do you want me to stay?" Grant asked, his tone hesitant. "I can sit with you, or I can leave if you need space." Vivian hesitated. Part of her wanted to ask him to stay, to hold on to the comfort he was offering, but another part of her was afraid of what that would mean. "I think I just need to be alone right now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Grant nodded, though she could see the sadness in his eyes. "I understand, but if you need anything at all, just call me. I'm here for you. Vivian." She managed a small, strained smile. "Thank you, Grant, for everything." As she stepped out of the car and walked up to her front door, she felt like she was moving through a fog. She was grateful that Emily was still asleep. She didn't have the energy to put on a brave face right now. She needed time to process everything, to try and make sense of the tangled mess her life had become. Once inside, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. She had thought that finding out the truth about Leonard would bring her some kind of closure, but all it had done was open up more wounds. She felt like she had lost him all over again, and the pain was just as sharp as it had been the first time. But this time, there was something different. This time, she knew the truth. Leonard had made choices that had led him down a dark path, and those choices had hurt not just him, but her and Emily as well. And as much as she wanted to hold on to the memory of the man she had loved, she couldn't ignore the reality of what he had done. The next few days passed in a blur. Vivian went through the motions of her routine, taking care of Emily, going to work, and trying to avoid the questions from her colleagues who had seen the news of Leonard's arrest. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to explain why her husband, who was supposed to be dead, had been taken into custody. She just wanted to forget, but the world wouldn't let her. One afternoon, she was sitting in the park near Emily's school, watching her daughter play with some other kids. The weather was warm, the sun shining brightly, but Vivian felt cold inside. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Grant approaching until he was right beside her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly. Vivian looked up, surprised to see him, but she nodded. "Sure." He sat down on the bench next to her, and for a moment, they just watched the children playing, the sound of their laughter filling the air. "How are you holding up?" Grant asked after a while, his voice gentle. "I don't know," Vivian admitted, her gaze distant. "I thought knowing the truth would make things better, but it just hurts." Grant nodded, his expression sympathetic. "The truth has a way of doing that, but it's also the only thing that can set you free, even if it takes time." Vivian didn't respond, her mind still tangled in a web of confusion and pain. "I don't know how to move on from this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed, it's all gone." Grant turned to her, his eyes soft but serious. "You start by letting yourself feel whatever you need to feel. Anger, sadness, confusion, all of it. And then you take it one day at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Vivian. You just have to keep moving forward." Vivian felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to break down in front of him again. "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's so hard." "I know," Grant said softly, "but you're not alone. You have Emily, and you have people who care about you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be one of those people." Vivian looked at him, her heart aching. "I don't know if I can trust you, Grant," she said quietly. "I want to, but I don't know how." "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "And I'm willing to earn that trust, no matter how long it takes. I'm not going anywhere, Vivian, not unless you want me to." For a long moment, they just sat there, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Vivian didn't know what the future held, or how she was going to move on from everything that had happened. But as she sat beside Grant, watching Emily run and laugh with the other kids, she felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was okay to just take things one step at a time and to let herself be vulnerable, even if it meant risking more pain. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that things could get better, that she could find a way to heal. "Thank you, Grant," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "for being here." "Always," he replied, his smile gentle. "Whatever you need, I'm here." As they watched Emily play, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the park. It was a small, simple moment, but it was one that Vivian clung to. A reminder that even in the midst of the darkest times, there was still light. And for now, that was enough. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, filling the living room with a soft, golden light. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and trying to gather her thoughts. It had been a few days since Leonard's arrest, but the shock of it all hadn't worn off. She had spent hours replaying everything he had said, every lie he had told, and it left her feeling hollow and drained. Yet she knew this wasn't over. There was still a part of her that craved answers, even if they brought more pain. She had avoided watching the news, not wanting to see Leonard's face plastered across the screen. But she knew that his arrest had made headlines. The story of a man who had faked his death, only to be caught years later in a web of financial crimes, was too sensational for the media to ignore. Vivian had even received calls from reporters, but she hadn't answered any of them. She wasn't ready to talk, and she wasn't sure if she ever would be. That morning, as she prepared breakfast for Emily, her phone rang again. She almost ignored it, thinking it might be another reporter. But when she glanced at the screen, she saw Grant's name. With a mix of relief and trepidation, she answered. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "Hey," Grant replied, his tone warm yet serious. "I'm sorry to call you so early, but I just got word from the authorities. They want to speak with you. Apparently, Leonard has agreed to cooperate, but he wants to meet with you first." Vivian's heart skipped a beat. "He wants to see me." "Yes," Grant said. "It's part of his deal. He's willing to confess everything, but he asked to speak with you one last time. You don't have to go if you don't want to, but I thought you should know." Vivian's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to tell Leonard to go to hell, to let him face the consequences of his actions without ever seeing her again. But another part of her, the part that still longed for closure, wanted to hear what he had to say. Maybe this was her chance to finally get the answers she needed, to understand why he had done what he did. "I'll go," she said after a long pause, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Where do I need to be?" Grant gave her the details, and they agreed to meet at the detention center where Leonard was being held. As she hung up the phone, Vivian felt a sense of dread settle over her. She knew this meeting wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew she needed to face it, to confront the man who had turned her life upside down. Later that afternoon, Grant drove her to the detention center. The drive was quiet, with neither of them saying much. Vivian appreciated Grant's presence, He had become a pillar of support in the chaos of the past few days, and she was grateful that he was there. When they arrived, he walked with her to the entrance, but stopped just before they reached the door. "Do you want me to come in with you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Vivian shook her head. "No, I need to do this alone. But thank you for being here." Grant nodded, his expression understanding. "I'll be right outside if you need me." Vivian took a deep breath and stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She was led to a small, sterile room with a single table and 2 chairs. The room felt cold and uninviting, a far cry from the warmth of her home. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly together, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Leonard was brought in, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked different, almost like a shadow of the man she had once known. His face was pale, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As he sat down across from her, they locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "Vivian," he said finally, his voice